Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and this week, I believe, is episode 43 of this series, if I'm not mistaken. Might be wrong on that, but either way, it is the very first episode covering The Path of Daggers, Book 8 of the Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. So this is, thankfully, based off of the timing of when all this is happening, the shortest book in the series, not counting New Spring. So that actually makes my life a lot easier as I work through these 4 diaries coming up. Today's and then over the next 3 weeks. Got a lot of busy scheduling and other stuff going on in my personal and freelance work life that are really going to heavily affect my ability to read very much basically anything over the next month. So I'm actually at this point recording this video pretty early ahead of time, covering my first week's worth of reading, and actually going to be continuing on to week 2's reading and making a video for that probably before this video even comes out. And you might be asking me, Casey, why are you doing that? Well, it's because of all the stuff that I had going on in my personal life. I had scheduled ahead and had all my videos and stuff planned out, and basically all the videos for April and May done already by the time that I'm recording this, with the 4 weeks allotted to Wheel of Time Diaries for Path of Daggers already in their spot, and deciding to, cut some of those if I'm reading this a little bit quicker, or if, God forbid, if I needed to add another one, isn't really an option logistically, unless I really rearrange some things, and I just don't really feel like doing that. So, yeah, today is going to be covering the prologue of the book and chapters 1 through 6, and then next week will be probably up till chapter 15, even though I'd be willing to bet that both of these 2 diaries are uploaded before this first one even releases. So, things are going to be a little bit different as far as my actual, pacing of reading goes. I did get through this week's reading pretty quickly. Spent about 6.5 hours with the book over the past few days, just reading the prologue and these first 6 chapters, getting about a quarter of the way through the book. So that really kind of puts into context just how short this is compared to especially, the last handful of books, which have been, quite lengthy. Shadow Rising and Lord of Chaos are very long, and neither Fires of Heaven nor Crown of Swords were very short either, although Crown of Swords was by far the shortest of those 4. This book is a good bit shorter than even that one is, by 100,000 words or so. I was able to get a quarter of the way through this book with only 6.5 hours of reading, as opposed to 9 hours of reading, or maybe even more than that in some of the last books. So, like I said, that kind of puts into context how things have been going. For the spoiler-free of what I've actually read and how much I enjoyed what I actually read, I gotta say, I'm a little bit more mixed on my reading this first week of reading The Path of Daggers, and that's because I didn't find the prologue to be very exciting particularly. There wasn't very much happening in it that served much more purpose than just okay, cool, we'll see when that becomes relevant to the main plot, or I think I see what's going on here, but I'm not entirely sure where we got this much info on it, or whatever the case may be. We'll get into more of that in the spoilers just a little bit later. But aside from the prologue as well, the first 6 chapters were basically finishing off the one thread that was more or less left open at the end of A Crown of Swords in the Ebudar plotline, more specifically the Bowl of the Winds plotline, and we're essentially wrapping that up for all intents and purposes, I believe, because at the end of A Crown of Swords, I nearly said the wrong book there. I thought I said the wrong book there. This is I guess technically spoilers for the end of that book, but I don't know why you'd be watching this video if you don't know about what's going on in the previous book. The crew down in Ebudar does obtain the Bowl of the Winds at the end of A Crown of Swords, and at the beginning of this book are actually making to try to use it and basically finish off the purpose of getting it, finish off that plot line for, again, I said, all intents and purposes. And, I felt like this material dragged just a little bit. It's not necessarily to say that it was bad or that it was too slow paced, but I felt like it was notably slower paced than I feel like it should have been. And definitely in comparison to the beginnings of previous books, or the setups of previous books. This feels like it's wrapping up something rather than setting up something. So part of the pacing felt like whiplash, and then felt like it was taking too long to actually do the thing. It took 120 pages in this book, and to be fair, those 120 pages each have less words on them than the past few books have had, but it still took 120 pages to actually do this. And now we're like actually getting to a point where I feel like this book proper is starting. So, like I said, I'm a little bit more mixed on the beginning of this one because it feels like it's wrapping up the leftovers of what the previous book, and quite frankly, the end of Lord of Chaos as well, was doing, because that's how long the Bull of the Winds plotline has been going on. And I don't think this is a bad plotline, mind you. I'm not gonna tell you that the Bull of the Winds is like the worst thing I've read in the series, because it's not, actually. It's not my least favorite plotline in the series thus far. And I thought it was good, even if it maybe runs a little bit long, or if I don't love that it starts at the end of one book and then ends at the beginning of this one, with an entire book in between that covers a lot of material. I think, generally speaking, it's okay, but it feels weird for the beginning of a book here to be covering it that way. Like, if you had, like, the beginning of this book being the beginning of whatever it was with a different plot line, and again, that's something we'll talk a little bit more about a little bit later, probably at the end of the video when I'm, projecting what I'm expecting from next week or whatever it may be. The end of this plotline definitely felt like it was in the wrong place. If you had the beginning of something else setting up the book ahead of it, and then you have this material to finish it off, which is kind of weird. It's weird that I'm suggesting this. I feel like it would almost feel less out of place, but then again, maybe it would feel worse. I don't know for sure. I just know that the way that Jordan includes and paces and organizes plot lines and POV allocation and all of these kinds of technical parts of the meta structure of the series, Jordan has some weird tendencies as far as this kind of thing is concerned. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I would say this is probably my least favorite start to a Wheel of Time book up to this point. Is there anything that would maybe counter that? Maybe the beginning of Shadow Rising I wasn't as hot on. Like, that beginning was fine, but those first 2 chapters in that book were really long and felt more like a very extended prologue rather than anything else, and didn't really do a whole lot. So, like, relatively speaking, I think this is probably my least favorite beginning of a book, just because it doesn't feel properly like the beginning of a book, if that makes sense. But we'll see how I start to feel, moving on into next week. But that's generally the gist of my spoiler-free thoughts. So I suppose we should move into the actual spoiler content of the video, talking about the prologue and chapters 1 through 6 of The Path of Daggers. So the prologue, like I said earlier, is kind of a weird one for me in that it didn't really feel too super necessary, in that, like, some of the information that was a little bit more new feels more like tangential, even more tangential than prologue information tends to, or at least the more significant portion of this at the beginning, and then the rest of it wasn't necessarily something that I cared so much about to make the prologue feel like a prologue. It just didn't feel like a prologue. It felt like an interlude more than anything. And I guess, considering that chapters 1 through 6 are just wrapping up a bit from A Crown of Swords, the fact this prologue is more like an interlude between the 2 books than anything might make structural sense, but thinking of it as its own book makes it a little bit more difficult. But even so, the prologue starts off mostly just with several rulers of the northern borderlands of this world meeting together, basically just encompassing and interacting with each other, making a blood pact to find Rand specifically, and it basically says this in the prologue itself: do what needs to be done with him. Like, it's not quite those words precisely, but it may as well be precisely those words. It implies that, I feel like the prologue implies here that these rulers of the northern borderlands want to, like, rid the world of Rand to some degree, because they feel like he's probably some sort of, like, active or net detractor to the world as far as his existence goes, whether he's a Dragon Reborn or not. And I'm not 100% sure if these people actually discuss with each other whether they think he is, but they're going after Rand is basically the point of the beginning of the prologue here. And that's like the main gist of what the beginning section of the prologue did for me, because there's a whole lot of names thrown out there. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on that was like, this isn't really relevant information, or like, it probably is relevant information, but it was a whole lot of stuff just thrown right out there point blank that was like, I'm overwhelmed. In fact, I actually had to use the Wheel of Time Compendium app to track all of the names multiple times throughout just the first, 10 pages, or maybe even less, of the prologue, because there's so many names thrown out there. It's like, wait a minute, do I know any of these people? And like, you don't know any of these people. They're just new names being thrown out there. So it's a lot. It's pretty overwhelming. The only real connection that I got out of this beginning section of the prologue that I feel is like worth super noting is that one of these rulers in the Northern Borderlands is I believe like the favorite brother of Kiruna, who is one of the Aes Sedai who had to swear fealty to Rand. So that's really the only like thread or the hook between those that exists, that I can look at and be like, okay, that's gonna, create or be a linchpin in regards to interesting drama and whatever that's going to occur whenever these people meet up with Rand, whenever that happens and wherever that happens in the world. But like, all this scene really felt like it did was like set up an extra form of antagonistic relationship to most of the other main plot threads in the world. And that's basically what it was doing. The only other thing I found worth super noting was that the POV character of this part of the prologue, Atheniel of Kandor, so the Queen of Kandor, basically, muses all throughout the chapter about the place of political marriages and stuff that are going on between the houses and the kingdoms of these borderlands up here, that they have to strengthen the ties between them, not just against the Blight, but now strengthening them against another foe, being Rand probably here. But like, what this actually has to do with any of the main series is yet to be determined. Like I said, basically every name thrown out in this portion of the prologue here was new. It was just kind of a lot, and I'm not really sure what to do with any of the information until it actually becomes relevant to the plot. That could be in this book. That could be 5 books from now, knowing Jordan's habits. Or I suppose not quite 5 books from now, because Jordan wouldn't have been writing 5 books from now, but you know what I mean. The next section of the prologue features Viren Sedai interrogating Aes Sedai prisoners of the Aiel, so the Aes Sedai that did not swear fealty to Rand, and the ones that were trying to take him to the White Tower in the first place. These ones are prisoners of the Aiel outside of Carrion. Is that the place? Some of the sea names get mixed up in my brain at this point, but I guess a number of these Aes Sedai are being interrogated by Viren specifically out here, attempting to learn something about their intentions and their loyalties, and I guess their suspicions regarding Rand as a character and as the Dragon Reborn, what they're trying to do with him to the tower, trying to get some of this information. Viren uses a method during some of these interrogations that she calls delving, which is apparently like some sort of wilder technique that is somewhat akin to compulsion. So I guess sort of like tricking, or maybe not necessarily tricking per se, people into doing or admitting information more freely that they otherwise maybe wouldn't. Maybe akin to like making them drunk or something like that. Maybe not quite that way, but that's kind of the way that my brain relates it. So she gets some information from some of the Aes Sedai, and one of them in particular, I believe, like named Beldine or something like that, who is one of the despised of the Aiel, not in good standing with them at all. This particular one says that she personally believes that Rand is the Dragon Reborn, and that he needs safety from the world / the world needs safety from him, which apparently is a sentiment that multiple of the Aes Sedai that Viren has interrogated have said. So there's like interesting, like sort of tangential information regarding the various different Aes Sedai's opinions on Rand given in this prologue. Like I said, like this is more relevant to me, more useful to me. But because it's not anything like super mind-shattering or really like adding to the world building or anything to some degree that a lot of the prologues up to this point have, it's a lot of why this prologue didn't actually really do much for me actively. Most of what it reveals is just kind of, outside stuff. So I'm interested to see what dynamic the prisoner Aes Sedai have in the rest of the series here, but I'm not so sure we'll get a lot of that very explicitly. We'll see, but it is interesting that at least one of these prisoner Aes Sedai who were taking Rand to the White Tower do believe that Rand is the Dragon Reborn, whereas a lot, at least up to this point, it hasn't been made very clear that if very many of them believe that Rand is the Dragon Reborn. It seems like just as many Aes Sedai seem to be in denial about that as seem to actually believe it. So there's still some question marks there. The rest of the prologue is just a brief POV from Moradin, basically explaining there's like an entire page of this explaining a very like chess-esque game within the world of the Wheel of Time, like I said, from Moradin's POV, and how he kind of muses to himself about how there's multiple ways to win this particular version of the game that he enjoys playing, and he relates that in his mind to how Rand is moving and how Rand is doing things and moving in directions that Moradin wants him to, and that Moradin is basically playing this metaphorical game, since what he's thinking about is a metaphor for everything that's happening in the world, I guess. How he's playing this game sort of from both sides somehow. Rather vague and mysterious couple page POV here that deals with this information that I found intriguing, but I found it hard to find it anywhere more than intriguing. Like I said, a lot of the material in this prologue felt kind of tangential or off to the side enough that it was like, I could take or leave this prologue. It feels more like an interlude of just a few POVs revealing a little bit of information rather than main stuff that feels like really important to remember. I'm sure a lot of this material is important to remember anyway, like I know it is, but a lot of it is like, I'll probably remember it when it actually becomes relevant, as opposed to I'm going to keep this in my internal RAM right now. So that's how I felt about the prologue. As for chapters 1 through 6, we have the finishing of the Bull of the Winds plotline, like I talked about before. Chapter 1 is from Avienda's POV, and I was actually tricked at the beginning of it into like thinking it was Birgit's POV for a little bit of time, which had me feeling a little bit of whiplash and made it difficult to get into this first chapter. But then the rest of the chapters, I believe, are essentially entirely Elaine's POV, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, that might be a lie. That's a lie. Chapter 2 has a couple of brief POVs at the very end as well. But aside from these couple of brief POVs, most of this is from Elaine's POV. So you get a lot of information regarding the end of the Bull of the Winds plotline. So chapter 1 sees the crew in Ebudar preparing to move to the Kin's farm that, is a couple hours outside of the city. Avienda worries in her mind during this beginning of the chapter about the boy Olver, whom, obviously Matt and everybody else in the end of Crown of Swords were going to search the city for ahead of the Shan Chan invading, which is a point we'll come to a little bit later. Avienda worries about the boy, but doesn't really have time to do anything about it. She assures herself that Matt's basically got that handled, and so she joins the rest of the crew as they go to meet the sea folk in a stable yard around the palace. A group of like 20 of them or something like that, because I guess there have been like kind of talks between the Aes Sedai and the kinswomen and the sea folk that basically says enough of them needs to be able to form a circle to be able to actually use the Bull of the Winds to the degree that it needs to be used when they actually get to that point here pretty shortly. So obviously this group of kinswomen and Aes Sedai have to go meet the sea folk and then, basically just talk to them. Over the course of this brief little traveling, I suppose I should note that Avienda ends up bumping into Teslin along the way, and Teslin promises to let all of these girls go on their way, despite still doubting Elaine's and Nynaeve's legitimacy as Aes Sedai. So there's definitely still something that's going to be going on with this character probably at some point in the series, I would anticipate anyway. Nynaeve in turn tries warning Teslin about the golem that they encountered at the end of A Crown of Swords, about Moghedien having been in Ebu Dar, about the Black Aja, and then about her, rambling about a storm coming, that something bad is coming to Ebu Dar here, which of course we saw from Matt's POV in A Crown of Swords, but we haven't yet seen in this book. It's jumping slightly further back in time here. Teslin essentially just does not believe her. So you see a little bit of Nynaeve evolving as a character in this moment. You get to see a little bit more of that from Elaine's POV in, a few chapters from now, but that is something that happens. The Sea Folk and the Kin both seem to be pretty unenthused about having to guard the Black Aja Ispen, who they captured from the end of the previous book. There's a lot of bickering about it in this chapter, whatever, yada yada. Elaine has Aviendha make the gateway to leave the city, and everybody leaves the city, but while they're all going through this traveling gateway that Aviendha is prepared, she witnesses a man watching them from above, and is fairly certain in her head that this is the Golem who they just faced in the end of the previous book. She's basically convinced by other people that it probably wasn't, that it was probably just one of the palace's servants, but she's still kind of internally roiling from this. She notices this and is fairly certain that it is the Golem. Moving into chapter 2, we have the whole group coming out of that portal, the other side, coming out of that gateway on the other side, just, out of the city, just outside of the city, a few hours away from the Kin's farm, where they have to, obviously travel to the Wind's farm. Aviendha unweaves the gateway that she had made, which sparks a good bit of outrage amongst some of the Aes Sedai, because apparently of commonplace practices, unweaving anything that you have woven is not one of those practices, because it's dangerous. You can cause anything from, like loud noises or flashes of light or whatever to happen to, if things are big enough, if weaves are big enough, or if they collapse too quickly or maybe violently or whatever, you could have like severe explosions. Like, it's very big danger to unweave what has been woven, and the Aes Sedai seem to think that this is something that is basically impossible, but Aviendha does it anyway here, because Aviendha is one of apparently relatively few people who can detect residue when magic has been used. So even if the gateway was closed, somebody with Aviendha's power would be able to tell that there's like magic residue here, that there's residue of the power, and maybe be able to replicate that, or otherwise be able to use that in some way. And Aviendha's worried that, like, whoever may be coming, if whoever was watching them, she's convinced that it was some sort of, maybe not Shadow Spawn, but she thinks it might be the Golem. She thinks it might be some other dark friend, whatever the case may be. I think Shadow Sworn is the term that she uses, being an Aiel. But she's convinced that there's something along these lines, and she doesn't want them to be able to use the residue to be able to follow them. So that's why she chose to unweave it, and it's apparently something that she has more or less learned to do, was to unweave magic, because actively undoing it yourself leaves no residue, as opposed to if it just, dissipates after hours or days or whatever it is, it still leaves residue for X amount of time, which is a cool information to learn actually about the magic. I don't know if that's anything that's been like mentioned in regard to the series before. I'm sure it has been. It's been like something relatively fleeting that's probably gone in one ear and out the other for me. But this is some way to like really solidify that information. Now I know that like magic has residue, and I'm probably going to remember that pretty sharply for the rest of the series because of these chapters, and that's pretty cool. But anyway, a lot of the Aes Sedai, very significantly chastise Aviendha for doing this thing because of how dangerous it was, even though Aviendha was very certain about how she was doing it and, careful about it as well. Nynaeve and Elaine both come to the defense of Aviendha here, and Elaine suggests that Aviendha should ask for help from some of the older Aes Sedai for something that she's got going on. I forget exactly what the context was. That's basically all that I wrote down here. Aviendha more or less refuses in fear of revealing secrets that she wants kept from being revealed in regards to like her and Rand. I don't know precisely what it is that's going on here, but it's something that happens. Elaine considers Aviendha more important than Ter Angrial, which is a weird thing to be clarified specifically in the chapter. Like, it basically says that more or less explicitly, that like Elaine considers Aviendha personally to be more important than Terangriel, like as a study material, I suppose I should clarify, because Elaine's, wanting to study Terangriel and learn how to be able to make Terangriel that work consistently. That's one of the things that she's trying to do, but she thinks about Avienda as like something to study as far as magic goes, and being more important than Terangriel at one point in this chapter, which came up really strange. I'm not sure what precisely that means or what that may end up being used for at some other point in the series, but it was something that was in there that I was like, maybe I should write that down, because that's a very specific thing to say if you don't mean to use that to some capacity. So I don't know what it means, but that was something that happened. And side note, speaking of, studying Terangriel and stuff, immediately after coming out of the gateway into this spot outside the city, Elaine basically futzes around with a lot of the stuff that they got from the storeroom stash over on the other side of the river, and like picks out some Terangriel and gets chastised by another Aes Sedai, of course, regarding the last person who studied Terangriel, who I forgot her name, but who had been doing it for decades, basically, and ended up burning herself out and dying just kind of accidentally, even though she was careful. So like, there's some of that going on, but yeah, that's how that scene ends. Otherwise, there are a couple very short POVs here at the end of chapter 2. The first one is of Moradin again, who was watching the group leave. He was not the one on top of the palace. He was like in his own room watching from a window, so I don't know if anybody noticed him watching, but he witnesses the unraveling of the gateway that Avienda does and muses as much as the Aes Sedai basically to its impossibility. He says to himself, that's like, wait a minute, somebody just did something with that gateway that should have been impossible. I should look into that a little bit more. So Moradin now knows that there's something going on here with unraveling. And he also notes as well that it's kind of similar to the way that some of the Aes Sedai have discovered how to heal a severing from the power. So like when Nynaeve was able to heal Swan Sanche from being stilled, or from stilling herself. Is stilled the right term for women? Yes, because gentling is for men, but you know what I mean. Basically, the idea that there's a lot of people in this age that are coming up with ways to do things that were previously thought impossible. So Moradin apparently knows that they have a way to heal the severance from magic, and obviously now knows that they can technically safely unravel magic as well, which is an interesting note. In this scene as well, a servant of the palace named Maddock tells Moradin of some of the things that were supposedly being taken away by the women who just left, which include things like the Bowl of the Winds. Moradin grasps the true powers like a way to, like, I don't know, like bubble in his anger or something like that, and muses, if you want to call it muses, some more about how changing the weather to some degree would affect his own plots. So I guess like Moradin is at least to some degree behind the entire world having this massive climate change, this massive like overheating that is seeing like everywhere. The average temperature just increased to a degree that is like dangerous and probably going to kill the world at some point. I guess it's implied that Moradin might be to some degree behind this, or at least in support of it. His plots have something to do with this, so he's not super thrilled by the idea that these women have the Bowl of the Winds and that they might be able to change the weather back to something that doesn't actually help him anymore. So he does that, and in grasping the true power, Maddock is apparently squeezed and in a brutal death. One of the pretty rare scenes that are actually pretty, not necessarily disturbing, but like legitimately graphic to any degree. The description of Maddock having been squeezed to death, and Moradin actually considers just, how surprised he is by how much blood the human body can hold or whatever in this moment. So like I said, it's one of those brutal moments, kind of like that one scene from The Great Hunt way a long time ago that I was like, I'm surprised that this series has something so graphic, relatively speaking, when it doesn't really do that very often. This is kind of another one of those moments, not quite as dark, but, a darker moment. But after discovering that he's just killed the servant, he's like, they'll probably blame it on one of the women, uses the power to open a gateway, and he travels away to who knows where. And that's how that little bit of the scene ends. But then you have another short POV from the golem itself, having sensed, something from below him when he had been watching the women traveling away, because he was watching them do that. And he senses something that I'm using he, you know what I mean, senses something that he describes as like being an itch of sorts, different from the usage of the one power. So I'm presuming that maybe the true power is something that is a little bit different, just kind of inherently from the one power in more ways than we previously understood, because I feel like the assumption, I feel like I can reasonably assume that what it is that the golem feels from below him, from Moradin's room, is the true power, because once he goes there, he also smells blood and consumes the corpse, the blood from the servant that was squeezed to death by Moradin. But it, leaves me wondering some questions about, a little bit more questions about the difference between the one power and the true power that I'm curious to learn a little bit more about. But the golem also notes as well that not only did he feel the one power itself being utilized in the the stable yard below when all the women just left, that he also felt it being used several miles to the north, where presumably all of the women have emerged from outside the city, and he intends to follow them. So yeah, that's how that chapter ends. And we move into chapters 3 through 6, which are basically just a train of, whatever's going on with this plot line. It's not a whole lot going on. I feel like a lot of it was a little bit, it wasn't paced horribly well. I would say several of these chapters took a lot longer than the information that they actually felt justified in containing. For example, chapter 3 is basically just a group of Aes Sedai, the whole entire group of Aes Sedai and kinswomen with Ispen and the Sea Folk basically traveling to the farm. And throughout the entire chapter, there's a bunch of tension and complaints between the kinswomen and Aes Sedai regarding Ispen and other stuff going on the whole time, and Elaine caught in the middle of it all. And like, that's all that happens in this chapter. It took me 40 minutes to read this chapter, and like nothing happened aside from, yeah, they all traveled to the farm, and there was tension about what, the kinswomen and Aes Sedai want with Ispen, and that's it. Like, that's all that happened in that chapter. So that felt like kind of a waste of time. A Quiet Place also took about 40 minutes to read and didn't really have a whole ton of other new stuff going on in there. Like, a little bit of more setup stuff, but again, not that much. The group actually reached the farm in this chapter, however, so I guess there's that, but it's quickly noticed or quickly discovered by the women, particularly, I forget her name, Alice? Is that how you pronounce her name? Alice? Alice? I don't know, it's Alise, so I'm assuming it's like Alice or whatever. I would presume if it was meant to be pronounced Alice, that it would be spelled with a C, but you never know how Robert Jordan does whatever he does. Either way, the Aes Sedai cause a panic in the farm because people notice that there's Aes Sedai amongst this group that has just entered the farm. So they're just like, oh, the Aes Sedai have come to like get rid of us or whatever, the fear that the kin have because of having been kicked out of the tower and whatever other stuff. Fortunately, the head of the farm, despite feeling like Rianne has betrayed them by leading the Aes Sedai here, Rianne explains to them that the Aes Sedai always knew about the kinswomen, about this whole circle of people, and that they've been offered a way back to the tower, and that they're not going to be, kicked out of the tower just inherently, and that they can choose to come back to the tower or do whatever they want in that regard. So a little bit of like easing of tension there. The Aes Sedai also easing of tension there, but that's basically how that interaction goes. The Aes Sedai also go to begin at this point interrogating Ispen here at the farm, outside of other hearing. Elaine and Avienda are forcibly not allowed to participate in this questioning, so if there's any information that is revealed by Ispen at this point, we don't know it yet, and it hasn't been revealed as of the point that I've read through, which is at this point the end of chapter 6. Instead, Elaine and Avienda kind of search more of the storeroom stash until Nynaeve announces that it's time to use the bowl. Notably, in these couple of, perusing through the stashes, Elaine has, found some Angreal that can be used by the women. She takes all of these Angreal so that when they go to use the Bowl of the Winds, various of them can use them for more magic channeling, and that's basically the whole point of the storeroom stash perusing at this point, but like that's all that happened in chapter 4. So again, not very not very much has happened for having spent 40 minutes worth of time reading. I feel like both of those chapters could have taken like 20 minutes and done exactly the same thing. So, that's how I feel about that at this point. But chapter 5 is when things definitely start to build up a little bit. Chapters 5 and 6 are a little bit more notable, and both are about an hour long. Again, I feel like both these chapters could have been a little bit shorter than they were, but it wasn't too offensively bad. But chapter 5 sees the strongest channelers all forming a smaller group climb a very tall hill here near the farm to form a circle of the power, linking to one another, using Angreal with some of them, just going through the linking process. There's a lot of tension and bickering going on in this scene as well that I definitely could have done without. I felt like there were several pages of very mediocre build up to getting all of the women linked together, which again, like I said, it could have done without. I feel like this chapter actually, come to think, I feel like chapter 5 definitely could have been a good bit shorter than it was, because there was a lot of like these interactions that were like, get to the point already, like actually do the thing instead of having these characters explain things when they've just told each other to shut up. Like, I felt like there was definitely some wasted time here. But after several pages of mediocre buildup, I guess the highest ranked Seafolk woman uses the circle's power, uses the linked power once, everybody in the circle up here on this mountaintop, this hilltop, however you want to describe it, have linked and actually have a whole very large amount of the power available for use. The highest ranked Seafolk woman uses this power to, how she describes it afterwards, is like turning the rudder of a very large ship to begin the process of the weather healing itself, where it'll take a little bit of time for the weather to actually start to fix itself, that it'll take some time for the ship to right itself, for it to realize that it's supposed to be going a different direction. So that's an interesting thing. So instead of the weather just, ooh, boom, it's fixed. No, it's going to take a little while before it's actually back on track. But this was just the first step of that. I will say using the bull was a pretty climactic moment. I enjoyed that moment in and of itself, but I was also rather disappointed with the moment because of how much of this buildup and bickering there was that it followed, that I was just not super into. But even so, after using the Bull of the Winds, the group notices that they kind of still feel, or at least the stronger users feel, a little bit of the power being used in Abu Dar, which suggests that there's like some very strong or very large amounts of the power being used down there if they can feel it from this far away. And they realize that there is actually a storm happening to some degree down in Abu Dar, and that's because they're noticing the Shan-Chan invasion, which happened at the end of A Crown of Swords there, but from an external perspective. They had also included seeing one of their flying creatures, which I guess is called like a Rakin or a Rakin or something like that, land sort of somewhat near them, like being near enough to them that some of them recognize it, or rather that like a couple of them recognize it as being Shan-Chan specifically. So all of the women up here at the top of this hill are just like, oh, okay, yeah, let's get to the farm. We have to leave like right now, because if it's the Shan-Chan, that means that they have the ability to, chain and enslave all of the power-wielding women, and that is not a good thing for all of these women to potentially experience. So they run very, very down the hill. That's what happens. I should note as well in this chapter, before the actual Bull of the Winds is used, before the actual linking occurs, that there's a moment of both Avienda being ashamed of herself for dishonoring Elaine to some degree, which Elaine kind of says you haven't done anything, forgives her for that, comforts her for it. And then there's also a moment of Nynaeve apologizing for letting Lan make her into a fool, basically, because they've just recently married and Nynaeve's mind is completely on Lan at this point. So you see a little bit of character growth for both of these characters, but especially Nynaeve, like I said, you get to see her mindset kind of changing to some degree in certain regards. And this is one of those moments of her actually taking responsibility, or sort of taking responsibility, I guess, saying no, I've been kind of a fool here and I apologize for that, actually saying sorry, which is something that she doesn't do very much. So that's something that also happens. But the end of the chapter is all of these women basically descending the hill to get back to the farm as soon as possible. Chapter 6 starts with them actually returning to the farm, where Birgit reveals that, she's recognized the Shan Chan from Falma because she was part of the Hunters for the Horn that came out in the Green Hunt and helped with that climactic sequence. So she had recognized the Shan Chan, the Flyers, the Rakens, however they're pronounced, as being Shan Chan. She had noticed them as well and had already gotten the escape from the farm kind of set on the paces with the kinswomen, just like, yeah, we've kind of got to escape. This is actually really bad. So she had already gotten that, set up ahead of time. So while everyone else is like basically preparing to leave, Elaine is holding the power because apparently becoming familiar with a location is a little bit easier or comes more naturally when you're holding the power. So Elaine is like holding the power in a very specific spot of the farm so that she can make a gateway for traveling, because there are two different types of traveling. One of them requires you to know where you're at to be able to go somewhere, and one of them requires you to know where you're trying to go to be able to get there regardless of where you're at. And the version of traveling that the women know is the one where you have to know where you're at to be able to go anywhere. So Elaine's becoming familiar with this so that she can open a gateway while everyone else is preparing. She gets to open that gateway, and the whole group basically travels to Andor in that moment, escaping. Nynaeve seems pretty distraught by the idea of leaving Matt and everybody else in Abu Dar for some reason. Again, like a little bit of like character growth for Nynaeve here. I'm not sure if we've seen her like really feel remorse for like leaving somebody in a certain situation to some degree that wasn't like Lan or maybe a friend to some degree. So like Elaine and Nynaeve both don't really want to leave Matt or anybody, but they know the danger of the Shan Chan. They can't stay, so they go to Andor through this gateway that Elaine opens, because that's where they were trying to go anywhere. That's where Matt was trying to get them to go. So funny that they're actually finally getting to Caemlyn at this point, or getting somewhere near Caemlyn, and Matt's not even with them anymore. So we'll see how that goes down with Rand. That'll be definitely interesting to see. Either way, they travel to Andor, and Elaine begins unraveling the gateway the way that Aviendha had done with the previous one, which is, again, not great. Doesn't get a great reaction from people, but nobody really notices quite the same way. Like, they kind of accept that this is the only way to let it go, because if any of the women whom the Shan Chan have enslaved know how to detect and use residue the way that Aviendha can, then being able to follow them is just a risk that is not worth taking. So Elaine's like, no, I have to unravel this gateway here. Everybody has to leave, like get everybody as far away as possible, because I have to unravel this. And she doesn't really have the power to do it. She's still kind of tired. Everybody leaves them essentially, except for Aviendha and Birgit. They're the only two who stay behind with Elaine as she begins trying to unravel the gateway. And she only gets to a certain point before the Shan Chan actually end up arriving at the farm through the gateway. So they begin like shooting through the gateway, attacking all of them. Very, very epic sequence here. The end of this chapter I enjoyed a lot, actually, I gotta admit. Aviendha and Birgit try to defend Elaine. They also make an escape for it as well, because at some point, like, Elaine's flat on her back. She's like, I cannot unravel this anymore. I'll just lose it entirely and can't risk that. So, like, we've got to get over that hill that everybody else just went over not too long ago. We've got to get over that hill before I can let this go. So Birgit and Aviendha are, Aviendha is basically using a whole bunch of magic to send like fireballs and whatever other bursts of magical energy through the gateway to keep the Shan Chan from being able to emerge through, or from really being able to attack back to any significant degree. While Birgit gets Elaine onto their horse, and then they all go riding, just to get over the hill as quickly as possible. By the time they're starting to get over the hill, the Shan Chan are starting to emerge through the gateway, and one of those Shan Chan has a Damane, one of their women slaves that can channel, and has the slave shield Elaine, since Elaine's using the power to hold the gateway. This means that the gateway is released, all the threads are released, everything just collapses in on itself and causes a huge explosion that injures Elaine and Aviendha and Birgit a good bit, but decimate's not the right term, let's say eviscerates the entire field in which, the gateway had been open just prior. Does the same thing on the other side as we see at the very end of the chapter as well, but this entire place is just eviscerated. None of the bodies of any of the Shan-Chan that had made it through the gateway even exist anymore. Like I said, the 3 women are pretty injured as is. They survive with fairly heavy injuries, but they just kind of sit there and wait because they see that Lan and Nynaeve are returning for them. So that's how that part of the chapter ends. You also get to see a little bit of a personal moment in between, or between Elaine and Aviendha promising each other, or rather saying that they want each other for first sisters rather than just near sisters. So getting a little bit more of a personal moment there in regards to specific Aiel culture. So that's an interesting moment, but that's basically the end of the chapter. You get a short couple pages, another scene from a Shan-Chan POV from the other side of the gateway, from the farm side, where the couple of them named Chulain and Elia, I guess are probably how those names are pronounced. They're riding one of these flying creatures of the Shan-Chan, one of these Reckon, above the farm, witnessing the sort of like firestorm that Aviendha is sending through the gateway, trying to defend Elaine as they're trying to get away. But then eventually at some point you have the gateway collapsing and the explosion that happens on both sides of it. And that means that like the farm's just gone, and this also affects the trajectory of the flying creature. So Chulain and the creature itself manage to survive, but Aaliyah, for whatever reason, ends up dying in this scene. Chulain and the Ray can survive, and then they're heading back to Abu Dar to kind of do something or other, but we get to see that explosion from both sides. I believe the next several chapters are actually following some Perrin and Zareen POV stuff, so we'll see how that goes. Anybody who's been watching the series or knows my opinion on the Wheel of Time at this point to any notable capacity knows that I'm not a fan of this storyline very much at this point, as I really don't like Zareen. I find her to be a not very good character, and I think that the way that her inherent interactions with Perrin just kind of exist within the series make Perrin a worse character, despite the fact that I really love Perrin when he's by himself and not thinking about Zareen. So we'll see how this section goes, because they're kind of on their own trajectory, doing their own thing now. So it's not even like you can use Perrin as a vessel to view Rand or anything, because he's been sent away as of like halfway through the last book. They're in some other part, I believe in the west of the world somewhere. But like that's about all. So we'll see how that POV goes. We'll see how that storyline goes. But I've got some of that, and then I believe I have a little bit of Rand POV as well at the very end. A couple chapters of Rand's POV before I am done with next week's reading. And I say next week's reading because next week, as of today's video, is when that video will come out. But it'll actually be, the next couple days of this weekend that I actually get a good head start on some of that reading. I believe next video I'll be going over chapters 7 through 14. There is the chance that might change a little bit, but that's more or less what I need to get through to be able to stay on track with where I need to be in the book for each of these 4 diaries, basically. So I'm going to spend a good bit of the next week getting through that. I think by the end of, I guess at the time of this video's release, at the end of this coming weekend, I might even be done with the first 3 weeks worth of reading, despite having only spent about 2 weeks worth of time actually reading the book. And I'm actually kind of looking forward to plowing through the book a little bit quicker this time around, seeing what that pace is like, similar to how I read The Dragon Reborn, which was very quickly, even though I'm splitting this out between 4 diaries anyway. Even so, I'm looking forward to the reading. I'm nervous about how the next POV specifically is going to go, but I have my hopes up that it's not going to be terrible. I did have a couple of people tell me that Zareen is a less bad character, in this book and moving forward, because you actually get to see her POV and you get to see her own cultural viewpoint of the world. And, her viewpoint of her relationship with Perrin, which makes her maybe a little bit less actively annoying or less bad of a character, I suppose, than she seems like she is from Perrin's POV. We'll see, because apparently my distaste for her is far greater than most people at this point in the series anyway, so I don't know if things will get worse or better. I'm hoping for better, because that'll mean that all of my time through the rest of the series will not be as bad in that regard, but I'm not counting on it. So we'll see what happens. That's basically the point of the end of this diary, is to say we'll see what happens. continuing on in the book, but I am looking forward to continuing and frankly finishing this book as quickly as possible because I do not have time for this to drag on. I definitely cannot afford to have another situation like with A Crown of Swords where I actually had to add a video for that one because I was reading it a good bit slower than I had thought I would. So far, we're looking like I'm going to be able to read through this pretty quickly. Fingers crossed that stays the case. But that makes the end of this diary, I guess, the end of the actual spoiler talk, now that I'm done considering what may or may not happen next week, or in my reading that we'll be talking about next week in the video. But yeah, that's where I'm sitting at this point. If you have any thoughts about what I read this week and how I interpreted any of it, drop that in the comments below. I'll, get around to responding when and if I can, because I'm going to be very busy. But I'm looking forward to continuing. I'm a broken record at this point. So I guess I'll just leave it there. Thank you for watching this video. If you did, I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. I also look forward to all of the other videos that I got coming out over the next couple months because all that stuff I've done a heck of a long time ago at this point. And I want to, hear feedback on the various many reviews that I have coming out because a lot of the videos that I have coming out are reviews. I'm looking forward to all of those. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.